But I don't think it's the end of NATO. I do think it is a changing security dynamic and relationship that we're going into with the United States, which it has signaled for quite a long time, quite frankly, going back to the Obama presidency. But for Europe and for the wider world, again, unpredictability is a valuable currency for this president. He wants to keep people guessing, and so he will do what he needs to or can to keep people guessing. I do not trust that Vladimir Putin is a good faith negotiator. And I think that anybody who does is being very naive. So I'm not very optimistic that the next round of talks are going to yield some great breakthrough. There are some influential people in the Pentagon who say, look, just leave Europe to the Europeans so that we can focus on China.
World Insight, Thomas Woliński, welcome. We'll be joined today by Philippe Dickinson, a former British diplomat and also Deputy Director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative within the Atlantic Council. We're going to talk about security issues, about NATO, about tariffs, and also about the war in Ukraine. Welcome, Philippe. It's a pleasure.
I would like to start with a question regarding NATO. So starting with President Trump, do we have an end of a 76-year-old security order for Western Europe and for transatlantic relationships? What do you think about that?
I think, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak.
You're welcome.
There is an understandable anxiety about the future of NATO for Europeans because American involvement has been so essential for a long time, throughout the entirety of NATO's existence. I think it is not super productive to spend time agonizing about what the future of NATO is going to look like. And it's more productive for Europeans to just say, okay, whatever the United States does or does not do, let's commit to our own defense and security. Let's ramp up our defense spending. Let's think about ways in which there are American capabilities that we can cover for in the immediate term. Let's speak with the Americans about ways in which we can demonstrate that we are stepping up, and then think about what a longer term security architecture looks like and how Europe can get there in a sort of sustainable way in the years to come. I don't think personally that the United States is going to back out of NATO altogether. That is not what the administration is saying. That's not what the president has been saying, or anybody in the administration. What they have been saying is Europe needs to take more of an active role in its own defense and security. I think that that is what Europe is doing. The questions will come in the details, and we'll learn more about those over the course of the year, particularly what the US force posture review looks like later in the year. To what extent are they going to change or draw down forces in Europe? To what extent are they going to move some capabilities that are currently in Europe, either elsewhere in the world or back to the US homeland? Those will be questions that Europe needs answers to help them plan and strategize. But I don't think it's the end of NATO. I do think it is a changing security dynamic and relationship that we're going into with the United States, which it has signaled for quite a long time, quite frankly, going back to the Obama presidency.
But it leads me to another question. Do Europe still consider US as a reliable partner? Because we have the issue between, for example, Denmark and US about Greenland. It shouldn't be among allies, those questions raised maybe. So is it a problem for Europe, again, to consider US as a reliable partner?
I think you have to split up two things. You have to kind of divide out what President Trump and his own kind of foreign policy and his particular diplomatic style, and the US as a kind of a broader partner. The US kind of institutionally, its system, it's massive, and it would take a long time to unentangle so many of the kind of relationships and partnerships and where its troops are placed around the world and all of that. Sort of unpicking Pax Americana, it would be a very complicated and time-consuming process. But then there is Donald Trump, who operates in much shorter time frames and who doesn't see the world in terms of these are our allies and these are our adversaries. Everybody is a potential negotiating adversary in his worldview, and that means that everything is within scope, because he thinks about the world in terms of a New York real estate magnate. Where the key currency in his negotiating style and approach is leverage. He will do whatever he can to accumulate leverage for himself in a narrow negotiation parameter. So I think there is a question about how to understand you're dealing with this kind of transactional president, and how do you move forward in those negotiations whilst protecting this wider institutional relationship that exists. And I would also suggest that, it is not a permanent change. The current configuration of US policy, American politics moves quickly, and so does this administration, and things can change pretty quickly. Again, if you think about that as there is an element of unreliability in that, okay, but that's just inherent with dealing with democracies, because the politics is fluid and can change. But I think the fundamentals of the relationship, there is some significant change taking place, but it's not a complete rupture of NATO and a breakdown of the transatlantic relationship.
As you're speaking of quick changes, then we are going to tariffs, because that's the most quick change we've seen in recent days. Annunciation about new tariffs, of suspending tariffs, and so on. Does the US administration have ended already, in your opinion, the whole tariff game, which we can say, not with China, but maybe with Western Europe or with the European Union? Because China is probably still ongoing.
Yes, I think it's important to separate out the trade war with China from the kind of the rest of the world trade war. The trade war with China, I think, has been the driving kind of thesis for some of the key figures in the Trump administration who are most actively advocating for the tariff policy, in particular Peter Navarro. It's the whole kind of, blue-collar America lost all of these jobs because of the China shock, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that trade war is going away anytime soon. It's going to be interesting to see how that gets resolved. And there will, of course, be knock-on consequences for the rest of the world, because these are two economic behemoths going at each other. But for Europe and for the wider world, again, unpredictability is a valuable currency for this president. He wants to keep people guessing, and so he will do what he needs to or can to keep people guessing. We had thought the first waves of tariffs that came in during his presidency were the ones against Mexico and Canada.
Yes.
And then the stock market kind of got spooked, and he sort of pulled back and said 30-day pause, and everybody thought, oh, well, there's Donald Trump. He's afraid of how the stock market will react, and so he's not going to go through with this. And then at the end of that 30 days, he did go ahead with those tariffs. So there is an element to which I think he doesn't want to be seen to be backing down too much, but he won't want to trigger a greater economic collapse. But I think he is really wedded to the value in his mind that tariffs bring in terms of negotiations, and that, again, back to the key word is leverage and what that means for him. So for European tariff question, who knows? He will probably ultimately want to be able to strike some kind of a deal, but it will be turbulent and confusing, and things will change a lot on the way there. The important thing, I think, for Europe to maintain is a sense of calm, a sense of unity and of purpose, and of, these are what we need to get out of the relationship on a trading perspective, on a defense perspective, for security, etc. Those things will mix. He will invoke security dynamics in order to gain leverage across the trade policy dispute. That seems inevitable to me. So Europe should be ready for some brinksmanship in terms of security assistance and NATO and things like that, as a means of gaining leverage on the trade and tariff negotiation.
And we are facing negotiations in London this week. What do you expect of them? Are we closer to any ceasefire or permanent peace in Ukraine, or is just a part of the game? And there are
personally, I do not trust that Russia is approaching these negotiations in good faith. Their interest is to try and drag out the situation as long as possible, to try and inch forward gains on the battlefield, to try and bank some gains in terms of sanctions relief or whatever kind of support it can kind of extract from the Trump administration, while at the same time holding the leverage of the aggression over Ukraine, and still sort of keeping that within its arsenal. I do not trust that Vladimir Putin is a good faith negotiator. And I think that anybody who does is being very naive. So I'm not very optimistic that the next round of talks are going to yield some great breakthrough. I think the sort of Easter ceasefire that Putin announced, again, cynical. And it's kind of looking to try and send a cynical message to the Americans to show that, hey, we are playing ball, we are trying to be constructive, and we do want peace. They only want peace on their terms, and those are terms that Europe cannot accept at the moment.
You're talking about being naive, and what about the U.S. delegation? Have they already sorted out that Russia isn't negotiating in sort of responsible way, as you said by yourself? And was the U.S. approach, I mean, personally, Mr. Steve Witkoff, a little bit naive? And have the U.S., in your opinion, of course, changed their approach and see through the Russian tactics in the negotiations?
You have to ask the American negotiators that,
of
obviously.
Course, yeah.
But in my opinion, what I sort of understand from the administration's approach, and think that they are right, is that you do have to speak to people. If you are serious about peace, you do need to give it a chance. And so you do need to give these kind of negotiations a chance. And maybe it's healthier to not approach those negotiations with the level of cynicism that perhaps I am bringing to this. I am a former British diplomat and have had experience of having to negotiate with Russians in the UN Security Council. And ultimately, we did come to agreements. And this was my own personal experience related to Syria about a decade ago. But the cynicism through which they kind of conducted those negotiations was deeply dispiriting and depressing when you consider
Mm-hmm.
that these are human beings and lives that are at stake, and they are kind of treated as a sort of a game and a sort of leverage and in some sort of grand strategy game, and not giving the due respect to human life that I think it should. But look, it's for the American negotiators to approach, so long as they are clear in their objectives, what they want and need to get out of the negotiations, and are going in with a clear understanding of how Russia typically approaches these things and what Russia wants to get out of this, then they don't. President Trump does not want to be seen to have made a bad deal or to have been played. And so something that gives me some optimism is that at some point he will recognize that they are being played, that the Russians are stalling for time, and that they have leverage of their own in terms of dealing with Russia, and will bring that to bear. That's the optimistic scenario. Time will tell whether or not that is how it plays out, because I know that the Americans are impatient. They kind of want this to be done. Trump doesn't want this as an issue hanging over his head throughout the entirety of his presidency. But at the same time, he doesn't want to be played and to, sign what is ultimately a terrible deal.
But we still didn't heard about what do the US expect from Russia. We still hearing what the US is expecting from Ukraine side. And we've heard last week that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said that the negotiations need to have a breakthrough. So is it not pushing boundaries into getting a deal no matter what, actually, in your opinion, because you have some experience, so you know how it should look like?
So the administration's giving out all different kinds of signals and messages.
Yes.
So Marco Rubio is saying, hey, patience is running out and we don't want to be doing this forever. And at the same time, Vice President Vance came out over the weekend and said, yeah, we're optimistic. Things should be done sort of somewhat soon. And part of that is all this kind of smokescreen, is all of this sort of chaos and confusion, which is sort of the modus operandi. I think it is. I understand and respect their impetus for getting a deal done quickly. We all want this war to be over quickly, but it can't be a bad deal that sort of sets Europe down a path of greater vulnerability to Russian aggression in the years ahead. I do worry that there is impatience and urgency to get something done, and that might leave Europe kind of needing to regroup and figure out how it can stop further Russian aggression, because Russia can't be rewarded for what has been, just the most brutal and illegal act in mainland Europe since the Second World War. It just can't.
Yes.
And so that brings us back to the question for the Europeans, which is, okay, so we have strategic autonomy in this. We are 500 million people. We are an economy that is 14 times the size of Russia's. We have 2 million people under in uniform at the moment. We need to kind of figure out how we can make sure that we're protecting our own interests now, that we're ready to fight tonight if we need to, and for the long term.
So that's why European countries have made to the table, actually. I mean, of course, the French, the British, and the Germans, who are participating in those incoming negotiations in London.
Yeah, and I think it's really encouraging, I have to say, the way in which a lot of the some of the bigger European players, the French and the British in particular, have been able to work together so closely to have a shared sense of what a common purpose is, and to be ready to kind of work in partnership and in tandem to pursue that. And now that we have a new government in Germany, I'm hopeful that
Not
Berlin
yet.
will,
Not yet.
well, yes. I mean, the progress is kind of inching forward. So with greater political stability in Berlin, hopefully, that gives us a platform for a coherent and united European response, and then also regionally within Europe, there are very strong regional groupings and cooperation that is forming, particularly amongst those states that are most vulnerable and appreciate the nature of the Russian threat. So the Nordic, Baltic countries and Poland really at the forefront of a lot of this effort. Collectively, you know, this is a really significant and substantial economic, political, military, diplomatic kind of weight to bring to bear. Europe just needs to remember that it is a strategic actor in its own right, and to sort of seize the moment to step into that role.
And is Europe ready for stepping in that role? Because since the beginning of the war, there was a lot of talking, actually, but not a lot of doing. And the problem is the new US administration have pushed Europe to make it happen, actually. But Europe is still needing time.
Yes, Europe needs time, but it also needs a sense of urgency. And I think it now has that sense of urgency. And I think you are seeing at the policy level, member state by member state, and across the multilateral institutions within the EU, across NATO, etc., new and innovative ways of meeting the policy challenge that people are really trying to explore. What the Trump administration has done in a positive way for Europe is give a sense of strategic kind of clarity, in that Europe cannot comfort itself that the United States is always going to act in a certain way, or is going to be a partner that brings X, Y, and Z capabilities to bear at all times. It has given Europe that kick up the backside that perhaps it did need. You saw that in February 2022, but the kind of the sense of crisis and urgency dissipated a bit once it felt like the war was it sort of reached a stalemate, that Russia wasn't going to conquer all of Ukraine in the space of a few weeks. And once it seemed obvious that the United States was going to be invested in providing support for Ukraine, Europe kind of settled into its sort of a comfort zone. The Trump administration has taken Europe out of that comfort zone. And in many ways, I think in the long term, that will be healthy for Europe.
And as taking Europe out of the comfort zone, you said, have the US administration forget about still being a friend or an ally with Europe? Because the US administration needs Europe in terms of China threat, actually. The United States can't be alone, left alone with the issue of China, actually. So, do you think that the US administration is still thinking about the tactics in terms of confronting China with Europe or without Europe?
Well, that's a big part of the driver behind the American impetus to have Europe play more of a role in European security, is to be able to free up some of the resources for the Americans to focus more on the China threat. And there are a lot of debates within the Trump administration and in the defense policy world about exactly what that should look like. There are some influential people in the Pentagon who say, look, just leave Europe to the Europeans so that we can focus on China. And that is the way in which I think they see Europe as playing a constructive role in the wider kind of confrontation with China, which the Americans are very, very clear about, that they see as the number one pacing threat in the world today. There is an opportunity, therefore, for Europe to show that it is sensitive to American concerns there, but also Europe needs to figure out its own strategic position vis-a-vis China, what it needs from a relationship with China, how to balance that with what it needs from a relationship with the United States. I'm sure that lots of people in Europe will be very reluctant to be forced to kind of pick a side. You can either deal with the United States or you can deal with China. But it needs to be ready for being confronted with that question and how it plans to navigate a world where the United States and China are increasingly distant and operate in two separate worlds than has been the case over previous decades. And as has been sort of shown by the early knockings of this tariff and trade conflict that Washington and Beijing is engaged in.
And the last one, there are ongoing gossip that Pete Hegseth is going to lose his office. What do you think about that?
Yes, I'm aware of the gossip and aware of the reasons behind it. Look,
what's too much?
I think that again, it's foolish to speculate. You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, we don't have a crystal ball, but we can speculate.
Exactly. We don't have a crystal ball, but I would suggest that they invested an awful lot, the Trump administration, in securing his nomination in the first place. There were a lot of difficulties and hurdles and obstacles that he had to overcome to get that nomination. It was a close vote in the Senate, and that they would be really loath to lose the defense secretary, such an important position and somebody in whom they have really invested a lot of political capital in his kind of future and survival, that they would be loath to just kind of like toss him by the wayside. And you've certainly seen some of the stirrings of the MAGA world rallying to his support and to his defense. And then you've seen a few people in Republican politics who are maybe not necessarily MAGA types calling for his resignation. The Congressman Don Bacon from Nebraska is a Republican moderate who I have seen has called for his resignation. So no crystal ball, but I think the administration would be really, really reluctant to lose Hegseth, given the amount in which they invested to have him confirmed in the first place.
Okay, but it could be just a mistake made at the beginning of the idea of nominating Hegseth as a Secretary of Defense. They will admit that it was a mistake, actually, if they will let him go, actually.
I don't think Donald Trump admits mistakes.
Yeah, I think it too. So we agree on it. All right. Thank you. I won't take your time longer. Thank you, Philip.